What's up, guys? Welcome back. We are working on the Mark IV again today. So if you've been around for a bit, you'll remember that I first built an exhaust for this car and then went to Tail of the Dragon with my friends, where I promptly blew this up and blew the timing belt right off of it. And then we got it back to Pennsylvania and it has sat in the garage, and I've been slowly working on it ever since. So what we're doing today, hopefully, we're trying to beat the rain here, because as you can see behind me, it is another sunny, beautiful day in Pennsylvania. But what we are going to do today is we are going to hopefully put the clutch on that motor sitting way back in the back. You can see all the stuff that's in the way here. So to do that, I need to take that motor off of the engine stand, flip it 180 degrees, and then put it back on the engine stand so I have access to the drive plate that is on the back of it. So that means I get to move all of this stuff out of the way and pull that stuff out, and hopefully not touch those beautiful, beautiful BBS RMs. So that's what we're gonna do today. If we have time at the end of the episode, I might get underneath the car and start taking the automatic shift box out from underneath it. Maybe. I don't know how long this is going to take. It's been a while since I've taken this motor off the stand, and when I did it, it was only a block, so it was way easier than having all the extra stuff in the way. So let's get moving. If you've been around the channel for a bit, or have happened to watch any of my other videos where I show you guys around the garage, you'll quickly realize that I have too much stuff for the amount of space that I have. My garage is actually fairly big for where I live. I'm actually one of the few houses on my block that has a garage at all, but my garage isn't big enough for the amount of things that I own. So to get everything out to an area that's big enough to work in, I have to get my floor jack out of the way, and then move all the wheels for the GTI out to the yard. And then I have the batteries out of the Mark I and the Mark II sitting in the engine bay of the Mark IV on battery tenders, so I have to disconnect those. And then that really thick black extension cord right there is the power cord for my TIG welder that actually runs across the floor of my garage. And then after getting all of that out of the way, plus moving all of the empty jugs of coolant and oil that I collect, I'm finally able to wheel the engine hoist out of the garage, followed by the engine stand. The engine hoist that I have is an old school solid hoist, not one of the folding ones, and it just barely fits between the cars. I'm talking like a couple inches from the fender on the GTI and a couple inches from the lips on the BBSs. I was really lucky with how I parked these cars in here, but now that we've gotten everything outside in the open, I can get the engine lifted up and off the stand. So we're all ready to pick this thing up. I'm using this hole here that would be for the bell housing of the transmission. Got a chunk of wood shoved in there so that the chain doesn't ride on the edge of the block and crack anything. And then I don't have a good solution for over here, but we're gonna go over top of the cam gear here, and I'm using that ear off of the engine block as well. So we're gonna see how this goes. Don't have a high confidence, but it just needs to pick it up, hold it for, you know, a couple minutes, and then twist it around and we can finish it up. So let's see how this goes. Being that I've never picked one of these engines up with the head on it, it was a little nerve-wracking to do this. I've always picked these up as just the short block. I ended up putting a block of wood against the cam sprocket as well, just to make sure that the chain didn't rub on the belt or didn't dig into the edge of the gear, and it seemed to have worked out well. I'm sure it isn't very good to side load a camshaft like this, but I figured for the short amount of time that it would be hanging, it would survive. Who knows? Maybe I took a few years off of its life, but oh well. Once it was up in the air, it was actually pretty well balanced for just guessing what length of the chain I should pick it up by. And then I just needed to take the engine stand mount off of the one side of the motor. Most people would probably zip these bolts out with an impact to speed the process up and reduce the time that they're working on a hanging motor, but I'm old school and got the hand tools out to take it off. All of the bolts came out like a breeze, thankfully. Not like I really expected them to be a problem. This engine has been on the stand for maybe 8 months. Well, not even actually, because I blew the car up 8 months ago. But regardless, all the bolts came out easy, and now I can move on to figuring out what holes I'm going to use for this mount on the other side of the motor. Putting the engine stand mount on the timing belt side of the motor took a little trial and error. There's 4 threaded holes that are almost in a perfect square to use, but the problem in my case is that the mounting arms on the mount don't slide enough to be able to fit on all 4 of those spots. The second problem that I encountered with those holes is that one of them I'm already using for where I put the chain to be able to pick up the motor in the first place. So I decided to go with only 3 bolts holding it in and see if I could finagle that 4th mounting arm into place after I had taken the chain off. Hint for the future, I didn't end up making that work. But 3 bolts was enough that I felt comfortable with it being on the stand. And the other issue with how I did this is that the 2 lowermost bolt holes that I'm using are actually at different heights than the top 2. So the engine stand mount is really mounted on a slant, so it angles the motor up higher on the one side. I only realized this when I went to slide the stand back over the mounting tube, and I didn't have enough height for the front wheels to drop far enough to line up with the tube. So I had to pick the motor up a couple more inches, and then the stand slid on no problem, and we are off to the races. As you can see, we beat the rain with getting all of the actual work done. So now I just needed to get everything back in the garage before it starts raining, and this will be a successful mission. The front edge of the concrete of my garage does not line up with my brick paver driveway very well, so it makes it a struggle to wheel anything like this back into the garage, especially when there's weight on it. So it took some strategic pelvic thrusts and some lifting to get the engine stand back in the garage, and then I just needed to push the engine hoist back in behind it. This isn't very hard to do when there's nothing hanging on the hoist, but the problem lies with all of the legs that have casters on them. They're all extendable, and even though I try to keep them in the fully retracted position, my driveway isn't very level, so they have a tendency to walk themselves out as I'm moving it around. So I had to fight to push all of those back in because, as I said earlier, this engine hoist fits like a glove in my garage, so I didn't have room to push it in with the legs extended at all. I don't even have really an inch to play with those. But I got it all put away and then loaded the wheels back in from the Mark IV, and we are all set to make some forward progress to get a clutch and a flywheel on this motor. So we got it all switched around, got it back in the shop. So we are no longer standing outside, no longer trying to beat the rain, which thankfully we did. I'm kind of surprised because normally I get really screwed on things like that. I generally get stuck out in the rain. So really happy that we got that done. But let me show you what holes I'm using in the block in case you ever need to hold a motor this direction. So I'm using, dim in here, that one between the tensioner and the water pump. I want to use this one as well, which is basically the same height in the block, but my engine stand doesn't fit. Geometry just doesn't make it. Then I'm using the 2 cast aluminum spots that are on the main seal housing. So that's how I'm holding it. Not the most secure in my opinion, but it made it back in the garage with no problems, so I'll take that as a win. So now the next thing is I need to get this drive plate off. This is from the automatic transmission. Volkswagen does make a special factory tool to be able to do this, but I'm cheap and also know how to make things. So we're gonna use this piece of scrap, and then it indexes, the factory tool indexes into either this hole or that hole up there, the ones with the bushings in it. So what we're going to end up doing is bolting it through that hole just like the factory tool would, and then I need to machine the stud that would go into this hole. And I might honestly just drill a hole through it and run a bolt through that hole, but I don't know. We'll figure that out as we go along, but that's where we're at. Really happy to get this done and get moving on to the next steps. So now I need to figure out what I'm doing to get this tool to work and get this guy off of my motor so I can put a clutch there and a manual transmission. I decided to move forward with the option that just bolted in rather than having to spend the time to make a pin and weld this tool together. I figured that if the bolting option didn't work, I could still use the piece and take the time to pin it in. So here I'm using a transfer punch to mark where I need to drill the hole. A transfer punch in this case is just a long shaft with a pointed end to make a dimple where the center of a hole is when you tap the end of the transfer punch with a hammer. They come in several different diameters so they can fit snugly into whatever hole you're trying to find the center of. And this particular set that I'm using today came from Amazon for pretty cheap. Now with the piece marked, it's time to go over to the workbench and start drilling. I did my usual center punch first to make the mark in the steel a bit deeper and then put it in my bench vise. The bolt hole that I'm using on the block is for an M12 bolt, so I need a roughly 1/2 inch hole to fit that bolt through it, but I can't just hog out a 1/2 inch hole in one shot. I mean, technically I can, but it's not the most effective way to do this and will take a while to get a drill bit through it. So instead, I use a 1/4 inch drill bit to get a hole started through the steel, and then after that, I go up to using a 1/2 inch drill bit. I think it would have been more effective to go through 3 steps rather than just 2, but it still got the job done. Then I can go back over to the engine and put this drive plate locking tool that I've made onto the motor. Thankfully my hole's lined up and now it's time to persuade these bolts to come out. I just bought this Icon 25-inch breaker bar from Harbor Freight before Christmas, and thank God that I did that because there is a ton of Loctite on these bolts. I don't think I would have been able to do this with my other shorter breaker bar. Not to sidebar this, the Icon breaker bar seems pretty stout too. I had been looking for a longer breaker bar for a bit and was debating on biting the bullet and buying something off of one of the tool trucks, but I'm glad I didn't and I just went with this from Harbor Freight instead. But again, not to sidebar this, now that we have all of the bolts broken loose, I can switch over to the ratchet and take these bolts all the way out. I know some people are probably thinking, why don't you just zip them off with an impact and be done with it? And frankly, in my opinion, a crankshaft is a precision machined component and has thrust bearings and several other components that I would say are sensitive to impact. So I'd rather use my hand tools and take my time. I thought the easiest part of all of this would be physically taking the drive plate off of the motor, but boy was I wrong. For whatever reason, the snout of my crankshaft has these 2 little spots on it that look like somebody hit it with a hammer, so the metal is mushroomed up a little bit. This didn't let the drive plate slide over top of the snout of the crankshaft, so I had to get some sandpaper and a file and try to knock those spots down a little bit. And then once I got those spots knocked down enough, I could use a couple pry bars, and finally the drive plate came off this motor. So we got the torque plate off the motor. It was a bit of a pain in the butt. There it is sitting below the engine. So for whatever reason, my crankshaft has these two little dimples here, like somebody smacked it with a hammer, and it created like a raised edge, which made it a real pain in the butt to get that drive plate off. The bolts came out fine, everything else was a breeze, but literally trying to get the the drive plate to slide over top of the snub of the crankshaft was a pain in the butt. So now we're going to move on to putting a clutch on this thing. It should bolt right up, should be relatively easy. The other thing to note is I switched the dust tins over. So this is the automatic one. I've cleaned it up since I took it out. But you'll notice they're a little bit different. So here, I'll just lay them over top of each other. So I don't know what the extra holes are for. I'm thinking maybe the starter. I really don't have a clue though. but there's an extra hole there on the right side of it, which is covered up on the manual transmission version. Truly, you don't actually need to do this. You could just get away with leaving this one in and just have the extra hole there, but I had this, so I wanted to put it in. But yeah, overall, pretty good progress. Now let's start putting a clutch on this, or really a flywheel first. So here is the clutch that we are going to be putting on the Mark IV. So it is a Sox OEM replacement, but this is their single mass flywheel conversion. So clutch disc. Of course, there's always packaging in the way. Fresh bolts. New clutch release bearing. Grease. Oh! Pressure plate. Don't want to bend the fingers on that. And then here is, oh Jesus, the flywheel. So let me put the camera down and then I'll get this out of the bag because I can't do both at the same time. So this is the single mass flywheel. So this is a highly debated topic in the Mark IV world, but some people say that single mass flywheels on 1.8s and I think 2 liters as well chatter a lot. And people just say that, you know, you should keep the dual mass flywheel because that's how Volkswagen designed this and blah, 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 blah. Honestly, I just went with the single mass flywheel because I am used to driving this or my Mark I that's outside. So frankly, I would just rather have the simplicity of a single mass flywheel in my car. I know how they tend to handle and things of that nature, so and I just like the simplicity, and it was cheaper, honestly, too. Single mass flywheels are generally cheaper than their dual mass counterparts. So now with all of this out of the bag, or out of the box, we are going to go put this on the block, and then we'll probably call it a night and come back again another day because it's getting late and it's freaking cold out here in Pennsylvania in the garage at night. Send a heater, please. All right, let's get moving. The bolt pattern on the end of the crank is asymmetric, so I had to make sure the flywheel was close to the proper orientation when I put it on. Thankfully, it slid over the crank way nicer than the drive plate coming off, and then I can move on to putting the bolts in. These bolts come with Loctite already applied, so you can only hand start them in so far before tools are needed. But I got them all seated against the flywheel, and then it's time to torque the bolts down completely. These get torqued to 60 Newton meters or 44 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees of rotation, so it's not something that I can just hold the flywheel in place by hand. So I need a solution to resist the torque rotation. Instead of spending the 30 some odd dollars to buy the correct VW flywheel locking tool and waiting for it to arrive, I decided to use a trick that I learned from Broke VW and VW Vortex for working on Mark II clutch and flywheel assemblies. Now on Mark II's, the flywheel just gets torqued to 30 Newton meters or 22 foot-pounds, so I decided to have some redundancy in this system. Instead of just using one pressure plate bolt and one wrench, I used 3 of each, so if something started to bend or give way under the load, I had other stuff to spread the load across and hopefully not snap the bolts clean off in the flywheel. One thing to note is that you should use the old used pressure plate bolts for this and not the brand new ones in case something does happen. That way you don't have to go buy more brand new bolts. But this janky setup held up for me to go through the entire torque sequence. The Bentley manual specifies to go to 30 Newton meters and then 60 Newton meters and then do the additional 90 degrees, which is what I did for this. I don't have the big money to spend on a torque wrench that also measures angle, so all I do is mark a straight line with a paint pen across the head of the bolts and onto the base material, and then I use a breaker bar to rotate the bolts the additional rotation amount that's specified. It kind of looks funny afterwards though, because you'd expect the lines to line up if you looked at this, but usually people use that trick to indicate if bolts have loosened after they've torqued them. But this method does the trick, and I can tell that I've rotated the bolts 90 degrees, and now I can put the clutch disc and pressure plate on. This kit from Sox didn't include a clutch alignment tool, so I'm also doing this the janky way. Here I'm using a 9/16 inch socket, which fits pretty snugly inside the splines to align the clutch disc to the center of the crankshaft. It's not a perfect fit though, because the socket has some wiggle room inside the end of the crankshaft, but I'm hoping I got it close enough that the transmission just slides right in. Only time will tell on that one though, and I guess I'll find out whenever I actually put the transmission on the end of this motor. Might have to come back apart, but we'll see. Also, I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you're doing this at home, clean off the area of the flywheel and the pressure plate that the clutch disc touches with brake clean or something similar to that. Those metal surfaces usually come coated with some anti-corrosion coating. That coating is usually over the entire part to avoid them rusting, but you don't want that coating to be gumming up in your clutch disc friction material, so clean it off well before putting the clutch disc in. And now that brings us to the easy part of this install, which is torquing the pressure plate down. I just need to be careful when I do this and torque it down evenly on all the bolts. You can't just cinch one side down completely and then move on to the next bolt, because you'll probably end up pinching the clutch disc in some manner, or completely side loading the one side of the pressure plate, and it's just not good. Unfortunately, during this, my light that I was using died, so sorry that this footage gets pretty washed out here with my LED flashlight. Final torque for these bolts is 20 Newton meters or 15 foot-pounds, and that's only if you have a single piece flywheel. If you have a dual mass flywheel or a two-piece flywheel, the torque specs are different for this install. I had to hold it by hand for this part because obviously my previous method of locking the flywheel in place couldn't work anymore when installing the pressure plate, but I got it done, and now with that complete, we are one step closer to getting this engine back in the car with a manual transmission attached to it, which is incredibly exciting and very motivating for me, because at this point, I really want to see this motor in the car again, but I got a lot of work before I can get to that point. So we got a clutch on the motor now, finally. So we are one step closer to getting a manual transmission into this car. Obviously, you know, I used what I had for a clutch alignment tool, so we will find out whenever I put the transmission up onto this if that clutch is lined up properly, and if it's not, maybe we'll have to redo some stuff, but oh well. I did the best with what I had available at the time. So the last thing that we're going to do to wrap up this video is, I know at the beginning I said that I was going to maybe work on getting the shift box out of the car, but instead we're going to do something that I kind of forgot about, and that is work on getting these snapped downpipe studs off. If you've ever worked around Mark IVs, you'll know that these are notorious for snapping, and you can see I snapped 3 out of the 4 of them when I pulled the downpipe off of this car to pull the motor. So I'm going to pull all of these out and replace them, but in order to do that, I don't want to snap them off flush again. I'm thankful that at least I have, you know, a little bit to hold on to. So we are going to help ourselves out a bit, maybe, with a little MAP gas torch and my stud extractor that I bought from Advanced Auto forever ago, that has saved my butt a ton of times. So that's gonna be the last thing that we do, and so let's get moving and wrap this up. I decided to go from what I expected to be the easiest to what I expected to be the hardest. So I started with the one that I didn't snap off when I removed the downpipe. Thank God I started with this one because I was a bit crazy with the flames coming out of the torch, but gave it a couple minutes of heat and then put the stud extractor on it, and fortunately this one came out like a breeze. This got my confidence a little too high apparently though, because the Mark IV gods decided to spite me on the next one. Same process as the first one, heat it for a few minutes, then go at it with the stud extractor. This time, this broken off stud did not want to budge. It moved a little bit, like that little 16th to 8th turn that just gets your hopes up that it's freed up and then immediately seized back up. If you've worked with stuck bolts and studs, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I hit it with a bit more heat, hoping that would help it out and avoid snapping the stud off, but my luck did not pan out for this one. It spun another tiny amount, and then that's when it was do or die, and I rolled the dice and came up snake eyes. The stud ended up snapping off just below the surface of the downpipe flange, so now I didn't even have a shot at welding a nut to it to try and get it to come off. In hindsight, I should have stopped and then welded the nut to it and tried again from there, because the heat from welding probably would have loosened it up, but you know, hindsight is 20/20. I moved on to the next broken stud, and again, heating up for a few minutes did the trick and it came out easy. And then the last stud was the one that I was most nervous about, strictly because of how close it is to the turbo oil return line. I really did not want to catch that on fire, so I decided to heat the turbo from the inside to avoid catching something on fire. Safety tip, keep a fire extinguisher around if you're going to be using a torch. No one plans to catch something on fire, but it seems like garage fires are a common thing, and frankly, there's too much value to burn it to the ground, even if the Facebook page is burn all the Mark IVs. But thankfully, that last stud came out easy as well, giving me a barely passing grade of a 75, and now it's time to go back and deal with this broken off stud. Luckily, the stud broke off pretty flat, which was a small bonus, so I center punched it to give myself a place to start drilling and went to town with the drill. I didn't want to catch any of the threads with the drill bit, so I'm only using a 3/16 inch bit here, but it makes it all the way through pretty easily. Luckily, these studs don't bottom out completely, so you can feel when you're through the stud before you start drilling into the turbo exhaust housing. With the hole drilled through it, it's time to go at it with an easy out. I decided to heat it up again to try and help loosen it up, but this area of the turbo is a pretty thick section of casting, so I don't think my efforts were that helpful. I've never had much luck in the past using easy outs, and as you're about to see, today is no different. Well, we had good luck getting 3 of the 4 studs out, so this was the one that didn't snap when I took the downpipe off. These 2 did snap, but I got them out, and then this one snapped on both sides. So that sucks. It is what it is, though. That's the beauty of trying to get stuck bolts out of things, is generally it's not a fun experience. And unfortunately, I made a lot more work for myself. So this is turbo, and you can see I got that stuck in there. So that is the top of this easy out, which sucks. This is actually the second set of these easy outs that I've broken trying to use them. I've actually never had, fun fact, I've never had these easy outs get a bolt or a stud out of anything. So if you're looking for easy outs, don't buy these. These are junk. I'm going to go and get another set from Lowe's because it's, you know, lifetime warranty. But I'm probably never going to touch them again. I'm going to throw them in the corner of my toolbox and be done with it, because this is just incredibly frustrating. So at this point, instead of, you know, being able to put new studs in and a downpipe on, now I'm going to get the fun of taking a turbo off of this motor, because I don't know how else I'm going to get that broken easy out, as well as what's left of the stud out. So that'll be a future episode though, because at this point, one, this has gone on too long. Two, I'm just frustrated at this point, so I don't even want to keep working on this. And so yeah, it's not really, you know, the high note that I like to end videos off on. This is probably the worst ending of a video I've ever done so far, but you know, it is what it is. This is the beauty of working on cars. It's not always fun. Things do not always go to plan. Things are just not easy. And, you know, if it was easy, everybody would do it. But not everybody works on cars to this level. So it is what it is. I'll probably work on that off camera and, you know, have an update for the next video or whenever I go back to working on Mark IV things. But yep, that's going to wrap this up. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and we'll see everybody next time.